To get the latest voting rights and election news, subscribe to Democracy Docket's free daily and weekly newsletter at democracydocket.com/YouTube subscribe. The sign up link is also in the description below.
Mark, Election Day 2023 has come and gone, and it gave us a bit of a preview of what to expect in 2024. There's a couple of takeaways I want to walk through with you and get your viewpoints on. I think the biggest takeaway from Election Day 2023 is that Republicans are so far out of step with most voters when it comes to abortion rights. And we saw that take place in 3 states this year.
Yeah. I mean, we saw it, most prominently in Ohio, where issue 1 was explicitly a ballot initiative to amend the state constitution to enshrine reproductive rights, so that Ohio would become a solidly pro-choice state. This was, Paige, as you recall, the source of some ridiculousness on the part of the Republican legislators and the Republican state elected officials in the state, as they did every possible maneuver, changing dates of election. They tried to raise the threshold for the ballot initiative to pass. They played all kinds of games with the language, but in the end, issue 1 was approved by 57% of the voters. And that is a big win for reproductive rights. It's a big win for democracy in the state of Ohio.
Mark, I want to talk about some of the things Republicans did to try to stifle this issue 1 measure. We actually started this year on the podcast talking about Ohio's latest voter suppression law, which instituted new photo ID requirements that, kept some voters from casting their ballots. We saw, and then Republicans also, like you mentioned, tried to raise the threshold. I really want to point out they spent $18 million on this August special election solely to try and raise the threshold to prevent this abortion reproductive rights measure from passing. And it spectacularly failed. And then when leading up to the November election, Republicans again tried to mess with the ballot language, tried to be misleading about what this measure was doing. So we just saw Republicans in Ohio throughout 2023 put roadblock up after roadblock when it came to democracy.
Yeah. And, don't forget, the mere fact that we had an August election was in and of itself an effort by Republicans to stifle democracy. After repeatedly saying quite forcefully that there should be no elections in August, they then reversed course and decided that they could try to raise that threshold by having a low turnout election in August, which, as you point out, backfired on them spectacularly. But I think the overall lesson from this is that Republicans don't enjoy majority support at the ballot box, and their issue set doesn't enjoy majority support, which is why you now see people like Rick Santorum, talking about how terrible it is. There are initiatives, but where there is a fair fight, where the rules of voting allow everyone to participate, where issues are put squarely before voters, they lose. And that is why Republicans are trying to rig the rules, not just in these abortion fights, but in elections more generally, to try to keep the possibility of winning. As I've said before, Paige, Republicans want to make it harder to vote and easier to cheat.
Ohio Republicans also aren't giving up, even though they've lost squarely at the ballot box over this issue twice before. They've already said they're going to try to put forward legislation, maybe a new ballot amendment to repeal issue 1 to try to stop people from exercising their reproductive rights, even though Ohio has very clearly said we want people to have that access and to have those rights. Moving on from Ohio, if we head over to Virginia, Democrats took back power in the state legislature. They now hold the majority in both chambers and can act squarely as a check on Governor Glenn Youngkin's anti-democratic agenda.
Yeah, I think we will now all sort of come to realize that Glenn Youngkin was a fraud from the beginning. I mean, he himself is sort of a fraud with those stupid vests of his. But the notion of like some Youngkin miracle, some magical Republican who has decoded how to thrust unpopular positions like restrictions on reproductive rights and sell it, that bubble burst. The fact is that quite surprisingly to everyone, Democrats didn't just hold their own, they actually gained seats in both chambers and took full control of the legislature after having split control and after it being believed that the Youngkin miracle would somehow lead to full Republican control in what has become a more and more solidly Democratic state. And it is not just a rebuke of the mythology of Youngkin, of the revelation of Youngkin as just another MAGA Republican, but it's also a repudiation of some of the anti-democracy measures and efforts we have seen. Republicans, if they had full control, would have repealed a number of the voting rights gains that voters have made in the Commonwealth of Virginia over the last few years. And we also saw some irregularities, right? We saw the illegal removal of voters from the rolls in the run-up to this election. We have seen Governor Youngkin refuse to continue a practice that's been in place for many years now of restoring people's right to vote. So as a Virginian, someone who lives in the Commonwealth, I can happily say we are now on the downhill slope of Glenn Youngkin's governorship. He will be out of office, and in the meantime, we are all safe from him, thanks to a solidly blue Democratic majority in the legislature.
Mark, we'll get back to that Virginia voter purge in a bit, but I want to highlight again the role that abortion rights played in this election. Democrats really made it clear that Virginia is the last Southern state that hasn't imposed new restrictions on abortion since the Dobbs decision dropped that overturned Roe v. Wade. And that largely was in part because Democrats held power in the state Senate. They now have the state House, they have the whole legislature, and they can stop any bills and appear that even try to restrict abortion in any way from coming up. The other big state where abortion was a cornerstone issue was Kentucky in the governor's race. Democrat Andy Beshear won a second term as governor. He was reelected. He defeated the state's Republican Attorney General, Daniel Cameron.
Yeah, and I think everyone needs to just soak in what Paige just said. Okay. Abortion was a cornerstone issue in Kentucky. And the Democrat who ran as an unabashed pro-choice candidate to protect reproductive rights, he won, and he won in a landslide. It is not just in Ohio, which is a Republican state, that abortion turned out to be a landslide winner. It's not just in Virginia, which in fairness is a more mixed state or Democratic state, that it was a winner. But in Kentucky, once again, we saw the power of Democrats running on this issue, and Republicans don't have an answer. If you look at what they tried to answer in Ohio, it was different than the magic dust that Republicans were selling in Virginia, and that was different than the prescription that Kentucky Republicans had. And Paige, as you said, in all three places, that failed and failed miserably.
Mark, abortion was a cornerstone in all three of these states, like we said. I also want to highlight abortion wasn't the only issue voters cared about when it came to selecting their candidates. As you can attest, in Virginia, there was a lot to do with school boards, things about book banning and the like. We should highlight that in Kentucky, Daniel Cameron chose not to prosecute any of the Louisville police officers who shot and killed Breonna Taylor when executing a no-knock warrant. And that followed him around. People wanted justice, they wanted answers, and he failed to provide any. And that was another reason why he didn't make it to the governor's seat. The second takeaway from this election I want to talk about, not to sound like a broken record on this podcast, is election deniers and how they continue to fail when it comes to the ballot box. And we saw that in Pennsylvania in the state Supreme Court race when Democrat Daniel McCaffrey won the race, defeating Carolyn Coluccio, who when asked if Joe Biden actually won the 2020 election, she said, I can't be too sure about that.
Yeah, think about this. It's one thing for Republican politicians to play stupid or to be stupid or to both play stupid and be stupid on the question of the 2020 election. We have become accustomed to politicians, Republican politicians, hedging and winking and nodding at Donald Trump's supporters by denying the outcome of 2020. But this was really something else, where you have someone running for state Supreme Court justice, like literally the highest court in Pennsylvania, who is also part of that election denying crowd. And beating her was a Democrat. And for everyone who's clear, the elections in Pennsylvania are partisan. I got some some blowback on social media when I refer to him as a Democratic candidate for Pennsylvania Supreme Court. He was, in fact, the Democratic candidate for Pennsylvania Supreme Court. But he will be a solid progressive on that court. I believe. I don't know the man personally, but I think he will be a very, very strong addition to a vitally important court. You know, the state of Pennsylvania saw as much or more voting rights litigation in the 2020 election and its aftermath than any other state. And it is a battleground state for president. It's a battleground state for Senate. It's a battleground state for the House. So, you know, it's a great thing to see that election results there. Not as much attention paid to that Pennsylvania State Supreme Court race as we saw paid in the Wisconsin race, but similar result.
Yeah, not as much attention was paid to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court race, partially because partisan control of the court wasn't on the line. Democrats already had a majority on the court. McCaffrey's election just solidifies that majority to 5-2. But it is still an important election. And I think, Mike, we should talk about why this election came about. It happened because former state Supreme Court Justice David Baer passed away unexpectedly shortly before the 2022 elections, which left a vacancy on the court and left an evenly divided court, actually, when it came to counting undated and wrongly dated mail-in ballots. Mark, if you remember, we talked about that at length last year when it came to elections.
Yeah, which is the reason why it's you know, sometimes we talk about the division on the court and we talk in ideological terms. Sometimes we talk in partisan terms, and I realize it can be confusing to people. But it is true that the court was before this with the vacancy 4-2 Democratic. That's true as a partisan matter, but as an ideological matter, the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court was much more ideologically narrow. Because as you point out, one of the two Democratic justices had actually voted the other way on the undated ballot issue. That's not a criticism of that justice, by the way. It's not nearly as stark an ideological divide between the two parties than it is in some other states. But I think the adding of Justice McCaffrey will give some room for error for those of us who are promoting voting rights when we go before the court, because there will be now more left of center justices to make our arguments to.
Mark, abortion won in states, pro-democracy candidates won in states, but we also saw some problems arise on Election Day and in the weeks leading up to it. Probably the biggest issue we saw happen on Election Day was in Hinds County, Mississippi, when 9 precincts ran out of ballots throughout the day because they didn't have enough ballots, they didn't have toner for the voting machines. But talking about Hinds County, that is the state's largest county. It's home to Jackson, the state capital. It is over 70% Black. And election administration simply just kind of fell apart on Election Day there.
Yeah, and I think there are 3 lessons from that we should take away. The first is that Mississippi is just a hard state to vote in, and it has terrible election administration. You know, every time you think that they have gotten the worst possible Secretary of State, they have a new Secretary of State. So that's one problem here, is just bad election administration. But the second is that it also, and we can't look past this, it has a history of discriminating against Black voters, and it has a shameful history of doing so in both intentional ways, you know, intentionally discriminating, but also just by the systems and the processes and the laws they set up, having the effect of discriminating against Black voters. And I think we saw that here, where, you know, state law requires counties to print enough ballots for 60% of the county's active voters, and you know, in this case, it just failed Black voters. But the third part here that I just want to put a mention in is that once again, we saw too many media outlets around this country, not just around Mississippi, but around a lot of elections, really sort of missed the story about why there were long lines, why there were ballot shortages, why there were these problems that were always plaguing Black voters or young voters, right? We've talked about this on previous episodes. When you look at who waits in long lines, it's almost always Black voters or young voters. When you look at where these problems take place, they are almost always in areas that have large Black populations, sometimes around college campuses. And that is the forest, right? Hinds County is a very good exemplar of that problem. But I think we're missing something if we don't understand that this is not just isolated to one state and one place. When I say Republicans want to make it harder to vote, easier to cheat, they do that in a variety of ways. It's in the intentional acts they engage in, like, in Alabama, the redistricting, process where they intentionally were not remedying the map that they drew that discriminated against Black voters. But it's also in these other ways, the resources they provide to precincts, the under-resourcing of cities generally around elections, the disdain that so many clerks have for college students to vote where they go to school. It's a systemic problem in this country, and it is one that Donald Trump and MAGA Republicanism, which is, by the way, identical to the rest of Republicanism, it is something that is we need to wake up to, and the media needs to realize that this is a big system-wide problem across a range of states, and they need to treat Hinds County as the outrage that it is, an affront to democracy that it is, but also it didn't happen by happenstance, and it didn't just happen this one election. So hopefully we at Democracy Docket, I know that this is something that you guys cover regularly. And if you're not already subscribed, please go to democracydocket.com and click on the subscribe link, because you'll get information about these kinds of problems that you see in state after state, election after election. It's not just the ones that hit the mainstream media. Democracy Docket will cover all of it. And Paige, I hope between now and election day, some states and organizations do more to prevent this kind of widespread stuff from happening again in 2024.
Hinds County was kind of just a perfect storm of voter suppression policies interacting with each other. Mississippi, it's a state with no early voting and very limited absentee voting, so most voters have to show up on election day. County officials said there was unexpectedly high turnout, which is good. We want more people to vote, but not great when you're not fully equipped to deal with that. And you mentioned redistricting as a problem in Alabama. County commissioners here also say redistricting was a major issue because for the first time, many precincts in Hinds County were split, meaning that they had to have multiple types of ballots for different races for the voters entering into those polling places. It wasn't just, they could grab ballots from another place and bring them over. Because of redistricting decisions, they had to have more different types of ballots, and they just were not prepared to do that and adequately, and just woefully failed.
Yeah, let me give a quick shout out though to a couple of, we've talked about the problems. Let me give a quick shout out to a couple of organizations that were part of the solution. The Mississippi Democratic Party, the Mississippi Votes, and Mississippi Center for Justice all went to court to extend the poll hours to try to give voters more time to vote due to those ballot shortages. Of course, the Republicans fought that. They actually went all the way up to the state Supreme Court. But that's an example of some on the ground groups doing really, really important work on election day to try to mitigate these problems as they came up.
Mike, as we're talking about election issues, earlier you mentioned the voter purge in Virginia. There was also a massive voter purge in Ohio shortly before Election Day, both conducted by state officials who very obviously didn't want people to vote. In both of those states, thousands of voters were removed from the rolls, some of them mistakenly, just days or weeks before Election Day.
Yeah. And, one of the things about this voter purge that I thought was most interesting, and there was a great article about this in Democracy Docket, which really covered this story from start to finish better than anybody else, was the use of the term quietly. Right. Frank LaRose, it was said, quietly removed 26,000 people. Well, isn't it curious that, for Republicans who are usually doing everything that they can do bombastically to falsely claim fraud, when it came to removing voters from the rolls, they did that quietly. Why'd they do it quietly? Because it was an even election. They didn't want people to know what they were doing. So they did it as quietly as they can.
Yeah, in Ohio, you saw 26,000 voters removed. In Virginia, it was an interesting situation. Governor Glenn Youngkin's administration admitted that they mistakenly removed people from the voter rolls. They removed about 3,400 people who were still eligible to vote from the rolls. They said most of those registrations had been restored. but they were cleaning up the rolls, quote unquote, when it came to felony convictions. Mark, you mentioned earlier, Governor Glenn Youngkin has not been a friend about restoring voting rights to people with former felony convictions. Officials went through and tried to remove people who were convicted of a new felony since their rights were restored, but then ended up removing over 3,000 people who were actually eligible to vote.
Yeah, again, another example of where Republicans got caught with their hand in the cookie jar, so to speak. Youngkin's administration says that this was a mistake. It was a mistake. It was a mistake. It's remarkable how LaRose does something quietly, Youngkin does something by mistake. The results are basically the same. Voters get removed, and in the case of Youngkin, they were finally called to task and admitted that it was illegal what they did. Right? Let's call the mistake what it was. They illegally removed these people. They can say it was a mistake, but they illegally removed these people. And sure, most of them then got restored. That's great, but it is still something that I hope the newly constituted Democratic majority of the legislature, I hope they do some oversight investigations here. I think Virginians are entitled to an answer as to why this happened, who knew what, and what was done to fix it.
Mark, the last takeaway I want to talk about from Election Day this year is the impact that voting rights litigation can have for voters. Once again, democracy was on the docket in a couple of states, and it ended up helping ensure that Spanish-speaking voters could get the ballot assistance and materials that they needed to cast their vote.
I want to make this point to the audience, to everyone in the audience, really clear. The rules of voting matter. The reason why Black voters were disenfranchised in Hinds County, Mississippi, is because the rules of voting matter, right? The fact that precincts were split was a rule, right? There's nothing magical that said those precincts had to be split. In fact, you would normally think, why split precincts, right? But the rule of doing that caused an outcome, along with other rules about how many ballots they print, how interchangeable they are. All of those things led to an outcome, which was that voters in Hinds County were disenfranchised and inconvenienced. And we saw lawyers rush into courtrooms to address those rules and the consequences of those rules to ensure that harm was mitigated. In Virginia and Ohio, again, the rules of who can be removed from the voter rolls, they matter. It matters whether or not you are allowed to remove a category of voters shortly before an election or not. And when people break those rules, it has real world consequences. And so when we talk about democracy being on the docket, what we are saying is that when those rules are unfair to voters, when they are discriminating against voters, the courts need to step in. What we are saying is that when those rules are broken, when people are ignoring the law and they are disadvantaging voters, the courts need to step in. And so Democracy Docket tracks and follows and stays on top of those things because it is essential to a functioning democracy in order to have rules that are fair to voters and that those rules follow. So in the case of the Spanish language materials in York County, Pennsylvania, and Union County, New Jersey, this litigation that DOJ had brought in Union County, that local civil rights groups had brought in York County, Pennsylvania, that essentially ensured that Spanish-speaking Americans, these are U.S. citizens, these are people who are entitled to vote, to ensure that they can fully participate. A lawsuit that my law firm brought in Iowa to ensure that on behalf of LULAC of Iowa, to ensure that counties there could provide Spanish language materials. These are critical things that without the courts, without the role of lawyers and civil rights lawyers and voting rights lawyers and activists and news outlets covering it and bringing it to people's attention, people would be denied the right to vote and our democracy would be less so. So I want to say thank you to the Department of Justice, to the civil rights groups in York County, Pennsylvania. I already thanked the folks in Mississippi and around the country, all the lawyers who contributed to this election day. We all owe you a big debt of gratitude.
Mark, all of this happened on Election Day 2023. In your opinion, what do you think this all means for Election Day 2024?
No election is perfect. We try to make it as perfect as they can be. But most importantly, we want every election to be free and fair. We want it to reflect the will of the voters. We want everyone who is eligible to vote to be able to vote and have that vote counted and accurately, and have the accurate election results then certified. And so 2023 had many of the aspects of things we fear about. We saw Republican election officials engaged in activity that is troubling. We saw the system in states like Mississippi simply fail Black voters. We saw long lines in way too many places for elections that are off-year elections. You know, those college students that you saw the images of at William and Mary College, the fact they were waiting in line, sign of enthusiasm, yes. Failure of democracy, absolutely. We should not be having polling places where students have to wait in line every 2 years or every year for hours and hours. So for 2024, I am both optimistic and I'm deeply worried. I'm optimistic because the system continues to work. The system continues to work because activists, because people committed to democracy, because election officials show up and do the hard work every day. The system continues to work because Democracy Docket and other news outlets like it continue to shine a spotlight on the successes and the failures, lifting up the voices of people who are doing things well and calling out people who are causing problems. The system is working because lawyers and courts around the country have democracy on the docket and are examining and looking at the rules of voting to see where they're unfair, to try to correct that, and also to ensure that the rules are followed to protect voting rights. But I'm also worried. And I'm worried because we are heading into another election in which it appears that Donald Trump most likely will be the Republican nominee. And once again, we will have months and months of him and his supporters pounding away at our democracy, pounding away at all aspects of it, villainizing election officials, lying about fraud, mischaracterizing the laws, vilifying the courts, intimidating people, and the growth of election vigilantism, which we saw, Paige, at the end of the 2022 election. You saw armed people at drop boxes in Arizona. We saw mass challenges. All of those things are putting additional stresses on a system that has already been battered now for years and years under the weight of MAGA authoritarianism and anti-democratic fervor. So as we head towards 2024, what I think we all need to do is, first and foremost, we need to make democracy our top issue. I know there are lots of things going on in the world, and they're very, very important. I know there are lots of things going on in this country, and they are critically important. But there is nothing more important than a functioning democracy and free and fair elections. And if we don't do that right, then none of the other things that you care about, whether it's immigration reform or it is protecting women's reproductive rights, whether it is addressing the existential threat of climate, or it is ensuring that every child has a first-class education, none of those things are going to be possible if we have a collapse of our democracy in 2024. So I need everyone to lift up and celebrate the outcome of 2023 for sure, but also examine what the failures are from 2024. What are the holes in the system? What are the unaddressed weak points? Where are the threats coming from? And if we don't do that, I worry a lot. But I have a lot of confidence, Paige, that the Democracy Docket team is on this every day, and I give credit to all of you who keep everyone up to date on TikTok, on YouTube, on Twitter, on Instagram, in the various newsletters that Democracy Docket puts out, in the content on the website. And I think if people pay attention and they act, we'll be okay in 2020. Thanks for listening to Defending Democracy. You can find all of the cases and all of the articles we mentioned today linked in the description of this episode. Please also make sure that you are subscribed to our weekly and daily newsletters, where you will stay up to date on the latest voting rights and election news. Go to democracydocket.com and subscribe right now. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave us a review. We're always interested in your comments, your positive feedback, your constructive suggestions for the future, for future episodes. So go ahead and leave us a review right now, and we will see you next time. Today's episode was produced by Alexa Rothenberg, Gabby Corporal, and Paige Moskowitz. It was edited by Paige Moskowitz. Defending Democracy is a production of Democracy Docket LLC.